Coming to you from parts unknown a few days before Christmas. Actually, those parts unknown are not so unknown. They're America. I happen to be in America for Christmas. Always nice to be back. Always interesting to hear what's going on the ground, to feel it, to taste it. I got to tell you, I have no idea if we're in a big old bubble or not. I have no idea if Trump will be successful or not. None of us can know. But you know what we can know? We can follow the damn trend. And today, before Christmas, two from my past, two interviews. The first interview, all about motivation, all about you. I mean, you can have all the rules, you can have all the techniques, but if you is a mess, if you can't keep it going straight, you're going to fail. The second guest today, a trend-following pioneer, a reminder that you can be a surfer and be a trend-following trader, a literal surfer, literally have your laptop in the front seat and go surfing and be a trend-following trader. Now, those are two great minds, and I bring them to you before Christmas 2024 because, damn it, we all need something good. There's enough negative out there. There's enough bad news out there. What I like, ultimately, is the positive. I like the optimism. Forget the pessimism. No time for that. So as we race towards 2025, please enjoy two of my best. My guest today is Jack Canfield, American author, motivational speaker, corporate trainer, and entrepreneur. He is co-author of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series. 500 million copies in print, 40 languages. Wow, that is insane. That is absolutely massive numbers. I am forever honored to have so many successful, interesting guests in this show. And Jack only adds to that roster. Without any further delay, let's get into my conversation today with one of the best-selling authors of all time. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Jack, you look good, but I got to take you off video because I'm 8,000 miles away.
Okay, so we're doing audio only?
Yeah, you look good, though.
That's fine. Take me off.
You got to click on your end. There should be a little video camera and just hit that button.
There we go.
There you go. Perfect. Yeah, I'm calling you from Saigon, so I'm a touch away.
There you go. You are a touch away. How is everything in Saigon with the coronavirus and all?
It seems like Asia's got this figured out a little bit. I'm more worried about the States. You know, I'm American, so I'm a little more worried about what's going on there.
Yeah, it's pretty ugly here. We're locked down in about 5 states. New York City, it's a total mess at the moment. I think they've had 20,000 confirmed cases, and you're not allowed to leave your house except for essential, like to go to the pharmacy or a doctor or a hospital. So everyone's learning how to do what we're doing, work from home. People are doing all kinds of webinars on Zoom. I'm amazed Zoom hasn't crashed yet.
I think my first question, just since we started on video for a second, how old are you?
I am 75 in August.
Okay, what's the secret?
What, so looking as young as I do?
Look, people, I'm not the first person to tell you this. And I like to think of myself as bringing this too, but you have a certain energy. And I know that goes all to your work and the way you live your life and all that, but it's a nice feeling to have that. And I know you have it.
I do. A lot of people say I look like I'm in my late 50s, early 60s. I would say about 3 things. Number one, I started eating very healthy and taking lots of supplements when I was in my late 20s. I got involved in the whole health food movement. Number 2, I exercise regularly, do yoga, meditate. Number 3, I've forgiven everyone in my life. Number 4, I am someone who is pursuing the things I love. I think when you're not living in resentment and frustration and blaming, complaining, but you're living a life of passion, doing what you love to do, that really helps quite a lot. And I have a great wife and great kids, so there's a lot of love in my life. And I've chosen to be loving and to be of service rather than to be in fear. So I would say all of those things probably add up. And I'd like to say it's good genes, but my younger brother looks older than I do. And my youngest brother died already. So I don't know.
There's something you said there. And look, this is going to be a conversation. I'm going to take you all over the map. But you said something there to forgive everyone in your life. That strikes me. I see so many people that get stuck in the past because I think forgiving is ultimately about letting go and letting go of the past, living in the moment. Speak to that some.
A lot of people think if they forgive somebody, they're somehow condoning what they did. They've sexually abused me, they robbed me, they embezzled money from me, they talked behind my back, they had an affair, whatever it is. And the reality is, when you're forgiving, you're giving for yourself. You're not condoning their behavior, but you're realizing two things. Number one, this was such an important thing in my life when I realized that everybody is always doing the best they can to meet some basic need they have with the best knowledge, skills, and tools they have at the time. If somebody embezzled money from me, they were trying to maybe feed their family or whatever. At the time, they didn't have the skills to ask or to negotiate or to earn the money on their own. A gang member, when they're out there stealing your car, they didn't learn enough in school to be effective at making a living. And so they're out there wanting to be included in the gang. They want to feel like they belong. They want to be able to take their girlfriend to the movie. So this is what they do. One of the sad things about our prison system is we don't really teach people new skills and new concepts, but we punish them. And so they teach each other how to be better criminals. So for me, I realized early on, and I had a lot of things that I felt resentful for. I mean, I had a divorce where I felt like I got screwed by the justice system. I had people embezzle money from me. I had a person screw me in a real estate deal. I can go down the list. But the point being, I realized that every time you think a negative judgmental thought, especially of anger and resentment, you're actually secreting more acid into your body. And we know that your body is healthy when it's in an alkaline state, which is why I eat mostly a plant-based diet, why I do the supplements I do, why I don't want to have any of those feelings living in my body, creating cortisol, ruining my neurotransmitters and all that good stuff. For me, forgiving is a gift. And one of my friends recently said, nothing ever happens against you. It always happens for you. You think about the things that happened. My first wife kind of screwed me financially, but it forced me to get really creative about how to make more money. And as a result of that, I did really well. It's when I started doing things like Chicken Soup for the Soul, and I had to get creative. And thank God all of those things happened. Garth Brooks has a wonderful song called Thank God for Unanswered Prayers. And he talks about in the song, he says, you go back to your high school reunion 25 years later, and that girl you had a crush on who wouldn't go out with you is now this overweight alcoholic. And you go, thank God for unanswered prayers. I think that we realize that everything really does happen for us. And if you at least leave your life from that principle, then you don't have to carry around a lot of resentment.
Before we dive into some success principles and really give people some hope for trying times, because I think there's no greater definition of trying times than right now in March of 2020. But I want to go back in time. I want to understand Jack as a young man. For example, Jack is 13, Jack at 25, Jack at 35. I want to see some of this progression. I want to understand the progression. What were you doing at 13? What was your mindset? What were you thinking?
Oh, I was a typical Midwestern kid. At 13, I was probably figuring out how to survive when my parents moved to a new part of town. I didn't know anybody. So I was just trying to be cool and have everyone like me and ride my bicycle and engage in BB gun fights and all that kind of stuff, crazy stuff you do growing up in West Virginia. Also, I was in a military school at the time. I was poor, but I had a rich aunt, and she had a son named Jack who was killed in an automobile accident. So she kind of adopted me, not to live with her, but to just kind of give me some advantages that my brothers didn't get. If my name was Bob, I might not be talking to you today. I got a good education, but I was going to a school where all the other kids, their parents were the doctors, the newspaper editor, the lawyers. My dad was selling cash registers. It was a really different world. I always felt like I was in that world, but I wasn't of that world. I didn't belong to the country club, but I got to be a lifeguard working at the country club pool. So I was in that world, but I was looked down on. So I was trying to be included. That's probably what was going on for me.
And as you start to move to late teens, early 20s, were there inspirations, were there mentors, influences that ultimately ended up shaping you when you were putting together something like Chicken Soup for the Soul.
Yeah, by the time I was in my early 20s, I was going to graduate school at the University of Chicago, learning how to be a high school teacher. And I taught history for a number of years. And it was during the civil rights movement. Someone that I met at a laundromat invited me to go to Jesse Jackson's church. I thought, okay, why not? I went that Sunday, and I really got inspired by someone who was basically had a message of motivation and self-empowerment, self-responsibility for African Americans in Chicago. And it was an integrated church, although it was probably 95% Black. That was the beginning of opening up my eyes. And then the same person who I met in the laundromat invited me to go to a lecture series called Masters of Motivation or something like that. I went, and there was a guy named Herbert Otto, who was the director of the National Center for the Exploration of Human Potential. And he was saying we are only using 10% of our brain, our mind power. So I said, wow, I want to use more than that. So I went up after the talk and I said, where can I learn to do more? And he said, well, there's this growth center called Oasis in Chicago. And you could go and take workshops there. That next year, I took 17 weekend workshops. I think I paid for 10 of them, and the rest of them I just volunteered to hand out Kleenex, workbooks, clean up afterwards, whatever. I ran out of money. But I got exposed to all this human potential where we have unlimited potential. And that's where I met someone who introduced me to W. Clement Stone, who was a friend of Napoleon Hill, who wrote Think and Grow Rich. And that changed my life.
It's amazing sometimes where there's the one moment. It's not exactly one moment for you, but you can kind of bring it to one class of moments. It changes everything. It's an amazing feeling when you look back on it. And so you look back, you're like, gosh, that one moment, and it pivots and opens up the world, opens up your eyes to everything.
Yeah, I should write a blog called All Started in a Laundromat. It's like, no, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been sitting there when this guy came in and said, put your book down and talk to me.
What year would that have been, probably, roughly?
Oh, but that probably was 1968, 69, right in there.
Now, 1968 was a really volatile year for America. It was the year I was born, but I know historically that was a rough year for America.
Yeah, I think Martin Luther King was killed that year. Bobby Kennedy or Jack Kennedy was in 63, I think. There was a lot going on. I mean, I was teaching in a Black school when Martin Luther King was killed, Malcolm X was killed. We had riots in our school. So yeah, there was a lot going on.
There would not have been, I'm guessing, at that particular point in time with a lot of strife and, again, that 68, 69 time period, why did you feel comfortable going to do something that probably to this day a lot of white Americans would not want to do, would not want to go to a completely different church with a completely different group of people? What made you compelled and want to go do that?
Well, I think what preceded that was when I first got to the University of Chicago, it was a Master of Arts in Education degree. We had this orientation where they took us around to a bunch of different schools just to give us a sense of the kind of schools that were out there that we could practice teach in when we got to that level. And one of them was called Rich Township, which it really was. It was a very affluent community. Everyone was wearing nice clothes, and the school was really well equipped, and teachers were cool. And then the next school we went to was DuSable High School, which was listed as one of the worst schools in America at that time by Time Magazine. The teachers weren't that motivated. The kids were not being educated very well. There was not a lot of supplies. And something in me, I don't know what it was, said, I could really make a difference here. So when it was time to ask for our teaching assignments, I said, I would like an all-Black school. And they gave it to me. So I'd had 1 year of that experience when the guy says, do you want to go to Jesse Jackson's church? So at that point, it wasn't that difficult. But I think if they hadn't had that tour, I don't think I would have chosen to go to see a Black school. It was totally outside of my experience. But when I went there, and because it was part of the journey, if you will, the tour, something in me woke up.
So far, though, if I listen to your story, and obviously I've read about your story to begin with, you're one of these people where an event happens that spurs you to the next event and the next event and the next event. It doesn't seem to be this great, well-laid plan. It's more like you seem to be inspired at each moment to follow the best course of action at the moment of inspiration.
I think that's really true. And I think people often ask me, what's the secret of your success? You're a multimillionaire. You've sold 500 million books. You've been in The Secret and, yada, yada, yada. I always say, I always followed my heart. I trusted my intuition. I trusted the inner guidance that I got. I was working for a training company doing very well. And all of a sudden something said, go start your own company. That was very scary. I had to borrow $10,000 from my mother-in-law just to start a company. After a certain point, I wanted to change that company, not do the same thing anymore. And when Chicken Soup for the Soul was at the height of its success, something in me said, I'm tired of this. I don't want to do it anymore. And that's when I sold that company and started the Kempfield Training Group. So yeah, I think that's true. I've always like the next thing that I would be exposed to or something would inspire me and I had the courage to take the risk.
I can relate to the idea of authoring a book. I've written 5. I've had pretty good sales in the hundreds of thousands, nowhere close to $500 million. But I want you to take me back in time because I think a lot of people that perhaps have either written a book or have thought about writing a book can relate to your early experience. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Chicken Soup for the Soul was not some big advance with a big publisher rollout, was it?
No, but let me take you back even further before I answer that. So in 1976, I published my first book. It was called 100 Ways to Enhance Self-Concept in the Classroom. And I had met a man named Harold Wells, who I saw something in a newsletter that I was reading, and it inspired me to connect with him. He was developing something called the Becoming Curriculum for kids in Detroit. We hit it off as friends, and I realized we were never going to get this curriculum out there at that time, but I said, let's write a book together. We did. It sold 400,000 copies, which for an education book is ridiculous. But I had a really good direct marketing guy who worked for Prentice Hall, was the publisher. But it was a lot of work, a lot of interviews, a lot of going out. And I probably did 300 workshops for teachers, spoke at conferences everywhere. And I remember my first paid speaking engagement was for $25. I drove through a blizzard into Connecticut to do a 2-hour workshop from Massachusetts, drove back through a blizzard. It's amazing I didn't die. And I got a check for $25, and I was so excited. I said to my wife, I am a paid professional speaker. So Chicken Soup came along. It's probably the second book I did, which was in 93. And as you said, we got no advance. We were rejected by 143 publishers before we found a publisher who said, well, we'll publish it, but we said, well, how many books do you think we'll sell? He said, well, 20,000 if we're lucky. And Mark Victor Hansen, my co-author, and I said, well, that's not our vision. He said, what's your vision? I said, we want to sell 1.5 million books in a year and a half. And he laughed at us. And I'm sure people listening to this have shared their dream with someone, had them laugh out loud. And he said, there's no way. I said, there's a way. He said, well, how do you believe you can do this? I said, well, we're entrepreneurial thinkers and we're visionaries. And we know how to make things happen, which in fact we did. So we sold 1.3 million in a year and a half. We missed it by 200,000, but he stopped laughing. A year later, he bought a private jet based on our income.
Let me keep you at that moment for a second. The sharing the dream and receiving a laugh. I definitely can relate to that. I'm thinking about how it shaped me though. I don't know that I wanted to prove that person wrong or it really stayed with me, but they definitely left something there to where maybe it just increases the drive more. You mentioned the story with your divorce where it kind of forced you to figure out how to make money in more unique or creative ways. Maybe for me, it's when someone laughs, it forces you to say, oh, you're going to laugh? Well, I'm going to double down and really get there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are motivated by that. I don't think everybody is, but I think a lot of people, I'll prove to you that I can do it. I think for me, my drive for success came from trying to prove I was worthy. I remember not too long ago doing some sessions with some people and really getting in touch with how I remember thinking, God, I've done 200 books. Is that enough? Am I worthy now? Part of my motivation has always been to make a difference. It's very pure. It's very, very clean. But there's also been a big self-esteem issue for me most of my life. Am I worthy? Do I deserve to be successful? Have I earned my place? Do I deserve all the wealth that I have? For me, it was more like proving I'm somebody worth paying attention to. I'm somebody worth admiring. I think for other people, you tell them no, and they go, I'll show you. So we all have the different things that motivate us. And at some point, we have to decommission the neurotic drive from the pure drive. I think I've done that in my life, but I'm not complaining. It got me where I am.
I like how you just said that you're kind of proposing a pivot. And I feel like I can relate to that idea where you just, at some point in time, the original thought or reason that kind of pushed for the start kind of disappears. And then it becomes this drive for the art or the purity of whatever you want to create.
Right. I think our ego drives us in the beginning. I think that's pretty natural. It's part of our evolution. But at some point, you have to transcend the ego and get in touch with your true self. I was just talking to a guy the other day who's written a book about, I forget the title exactly, but I think it was called The Book of You or something like that. He was saying, he reminded me of a story that I put in the first Chicken Soup for the Soul book. And he said, "You're the reason I wrote this book." And I said, "Tell me more." And there's a story in that book called the Golden Buddha story. And it's a story about when I went to Thailand with my wife. We were doing some workshops for the government over there. Then we had a few days to be tourists. And if you go to Bangkok, one of the things you do as a tourist, you visit 3 Buddhist temples. And one of the temples is called the Temple of the Golden Buddha. And there's about a 10.5-foot tall solid gold Buddha worth about $196 million just if you were to melt down the gold. It said in a little box that was right next to it on the right-hand side on the wall where there was a piece of clay, it said in 1954, they did not know there was such a thing as a golden Buddha. They were moving this clay Buddha from one side of Bangkok to the other to make way for a road they were going to put through where this temple was. As they were lifting it up, it was surprisingly heavy. And the crane wasn't really expected, it wasn't ready for that much weight. And it kind of came back down on the earth and cracked. It started to rain and they put a tarp over it to keep it dry. And that night, the head monk came out and he shined a light under the tarp to see if it was staying dry. And he saw something gleamed back from inside the crack. And he knew that clay does not reflect light. So he, in the back where it wouldn't show if he was wrong, he chipped away at it and discovered this golden Buddha inside. Their best guess is that 300 years earlier, the Burmese were attacking Thailand and they were killing everyone along the way and stealing all their valuable things. And the message had gotten down to Bangkok. So they covered this golden Buddha with clay and painted it so no one would think it was valuable. They wouldn't melt it down. And here it was for hundreds of years. Nobody knew the golden Buddha was inside. The metaphor that my wife and I talked about at dinner that night was inside of each of us, there is a golden Buddha. There's a golden essence. There's a Christ consciousness, whatever you want to call it. And yet it's covered up with the clay of our conditioning, our cultural conditioning that we get that makes some people racist, to make some people not, make some people Christians and some people Buddhists and some people Muslims, because it's just the conditioning you got growing up. At some point, we're responsible for removing the clay and getting back to the original essence of who we are. And I think that's what a lot of the world is doing right now. I think even during this coronavirus pandemic that we're all in, we're starting to see that we're all really one, that we can't hide. The virus does not decide if you're rich, I'll leave you alone, or if you live in this place or you're a U.S. senator, you're good. Everybody's on the same boat. We're all on the same boat when it comes to the ecological issues we're facing with the mass extinctions we're experiencing. I think that our culture and what's happening in the world is kind of forcing us to maybe take some of this clay off a lot quicker and start loving each other and supporting each other and serving each other as you're doing with your podcast and I do with my work.
Before I bring us up to current date and really start to open and unpack some of your work for these, quote, trying times right now, you mentioned Bangkok. I've been in Southeast Asia. I guess the first time was about 8 years ago, and I've spent the better part of 7 or 8 years, the last 7 or 8 years here. Can you speak to, as you bring up that Bangkok experience, I don't know how to describe it exactly for me, but I remember seeing some of those Bangkok temples, some of those golden Buddhas for the first time, and in other countries in Southeast Asia, etc. What is it? What is it about that when you see and feel that for the first time, for example, as an American, it really changes you, broadens you, opens you up? I still don't have my finger on it exactly, but I'm so happy to have had the initial experience and to have it change me.
Yeah, I think, one of the sad things I've learned recently is I forget the exact number, but how few Americans even have a passport. The reality is when you travel, I think Mark Twain said this way back when, Samuel Clemens, he said, when you travel, you go and your beliefs get challenged. You wake up to other possibilities. The first time I went to Taj Mahal in India, the first time I saw the golden Buddhas or the reclining Buddha in Bangkok, the first time I seen some of the temples in other Asian countries, the Chinese wall, etc. It shakes you at some level because you're just not familiar with sometimes the magnitude, sometimes the reverence, sometimes the awe inspiration that is created when you climb a mountain or you go to Machu Picchu or whatever. For me, every time I travel, I meet different people. For example, the first time I was in Singapore, I had just seen the movie Gandhi. And I was kind of embarrassed that I had mostly a British background. My grandparents were British and German. When I was seeing what the British had done to India in the movie Gandhi, I felt kind of embarrassed about it. I was saying it to this general in the Air Force who I was having dinner with in Singapore at his home. He said, "Oh, no, thank God for the British." I said, "What? Why?" He said, "We'd have no postal system. We'd have no railroad. We'd have no communication." You just keep getting opened up to new possibilities. First time I meditated in a temple in India, I mean, I got stoned, not stoned like from marijuana, but stoned in a level where I didn't know you could feel that happy so quickly with another group of people chanting some words that I never heard before. And the same thing, I've had that in Christian meditation centers and doing Sufi dancing with the Sikhs and with the Sufis, which is a Muslim tradition of spiritual growth. Each of those just opens us up to new possibilities and seeing the world through new eyes. And I think you're just more expanded, I guess would be the word.
As we expand out today, here we are. I don't know, is this going to ultimately end up being the biggest event in the last century? I don't know. The wars were pretty terrible. World War I, World War II. This economically is going to be really trying. A lot of people, I think when they post the jobs numbers, people are going to be terrible. It's going to be so many people that have perhaps overnight feel like they've lost hope. And I think the great thing about having somebody like you on my show right now is your work's about hope. If somebody's at kind of a quote bottom, or somebody's at a transition, or somebody's just feeling terrible, if they can find their way into a lot of the work that you've put together, they can really find a chance to kind of rebuild, a chance to get started again. But I think it's probably it can take an event like this to perhaps get some people over to your world. Because look, even though you've sold all those books, there's a ton of people that have never in their entire life gone down the path of understanding the messages that you've put together.
It's very true. A small percentage. I mean, they've sold 500 million books, but you got 8 billion people on the planet, and many of those books were sold to the same person. Yes, it's absolutely the case. The good news is that there's more and more people like you and me and others who are out there doing this work. There are more podcasts, more blogs, more people talking. There are more television shows like Oprah's, people talking all the time. There are these YouTube channels with all the TEDx talks and so forth. So there is a quickening of what's happening. And I think sometimes it takes people to hit bottom to realize there's a better place to be. And I think we all now are being called to step up to a new level. One of the things that I learned early on, when a recession hits, when a depression hits, when the pandemic hits, there's actually no less food on the planet than there's ever been. There's no less dollars floating around. They're still there. There's no less toilet paper, except for the fact that people have hoarded it, but there'll be plenty of toilet paper. Everything still exists. It existed the day before the market crashed. The issue is, are we willing to keep interacting with each other and finding creative ways to support each other? Can I trade for food? Can I do something for you and you do something for me? If I'm a landlord, can I say, hey, how about you don't pay my rent for the next 3 months? I'm not going to evict you. Already some governments have made it illegal. In Canada, you can't evict anyone for 6 months right now. It's illegal. In California, it's illegal to turn off the electricity of anybody. People are starting to say, look, we're all in this together. Let's work together and let's forgive each other. So if everyone plays, it works. We just put the society on pause for a little bit. In other words, I don't pay my rent. My landlord can't pay the bank. The bank says, okay, I'm not going to charge you your mortgage payments for this apartment building you own. And then the banks are going to get bailed out by the government, because they will. Everybody can say, just calm down. One of my friends came up with an amazing idea the other day. He said, how about you borrow money from the government equal to 1 year's salary? But it's a loan. And you get 1 year, 2 years, 3 years to pay it off. And you pay it off with no interest, or like 1% interest, or whatever it is. But only the people who need it, not me like a millionaire, are people that are going to actually borrow it, instead of what's being proposed now, which is everyone's going to get a check for $2,000. Well, how long is that going to last? Some people's rent is more than that a month, especially if you live in New York City or Los Angeles. There's a lot of creativity that's going to come forward. We all just have to say, look, we're all in this together. Let's help each other. Let's support each other. I was excited to see someone did an article recently, 2 days ago, about some woman in Canada. That we have this term called scaremongers, people that go around and try to scare everybody. She came up with the term caremongers. And so she organized people in her neighborhood. She said, some people can't go out. They're too old, quarantined, or at least physically distancing ourselves from each other. How about some of the younger people? We get together and we go to our neighbors and we say, do you need any food? Can I go to the pharmacy for you? Is there anything you need done? Within 1 day, over 1,000 people signed up. And now nationwide, it went from one city to nationwide. Tens of thousands of people have signed up to do that. I live in a little small community called Hope Ranch, which is part of Santa Barbara, California. Already we have a community newsletter that everyone can post things in online. There have been at least 200 posts of people saying, how can I help? High school kids saying, we're out of school. We're not going to school. I don't want to do things and get in trouble. If any of you need anything done, I've now arranged 40 kids who are all willing to help out. That kind of thing could always be done. But we just have to say, let's be humane, let's be loving, let's be kind, and let's help each other get through this.
My audience is listening to a very calm, caring individual. You talk right now. You're talking about helping and supporting each other. However, if people hear, some people hear, not me, I love this statement, but if some people hear this statement, take 100% responsibility for your life, in a moment like right now, that could cause some people to be like, I'm not listening. That guy's crazy. Forget it. That's the wrong message right now. Speak to how it's not the wrong message and it doesn't conflict with what you've been saying for the last 30 minutes at all.
Well, to really understand that statement, you have to understand a little formula I put in the first chapter of my Success Principles book. It's also in the first chapter of the Success Principles workbook, which is my new book that's just come out. And the little formula says E plus R equals O. That stands for event plus your response, that's the R, equals the outcome that you get. We have an event now called a worldwide pandemic. The result of what I'm going to experience, the outcome of what I'm experiencing right this moment, I am 100% responsible for. In other words, basically, there's three things you can control your responses: your thinking, your images, and your behavior. So that what you think, what you picture, and what you do or say. I'm responsible for that. If I start thinking I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose my house, I'm not going to be able to pay the rent, I'm going to get sick, my mother's going to die, you're going to feel crappy. If on the other hand, you say, look, I can get through this, I have the skills, the knowledge, the friendship circles, the ability to ask for what I want, the ability to negotiate, the ability to be creative, to start thinking about how can I do business from my home. For example, anyone in the business you and I are in can do podcasts online. We can do video seminars. We can do webinars. We can charge people for that. We can run multi-level businesses from home, selling all kinds of health products and essential oils and things that help build your immune system. So there's lots of different ways to become useful and to be able to make a living, even if you've lost your job as a waiter. There are other ways, there are things you can do, but you have to get creative, because the minute you go into fear, which is a choice, which is a response, you start scaring yourself by imagining terrible things, you're now in the amygdala, which is in the back of your brain, which hijacks the prefrontal cortex of your brain, which is where rational thought and creative thinking comes from. So you're not going to be able to make rational decisions. We now know in America, gun sales, just, I think it was Delaware or New Jersey, have gone up 1,400%. Meaning 1,440% more people are buying guns because they're scared people are going to run out of food and then come try to take their house and their food or their gold or whatever. That's when you're in the amygdala. You're going to make decisions that are based on fear. When you're in your prefrontal cortex, you can think rational thoughts about how can we get through this together? Where can I reach out to? How can I get what I need, etc. So basically, I'm responsible for the thoughts I think. I can think thoughts that make me feel miserable. I can think thoughts that make me feel positive. In a more calm time, I would use the example, if your husband forgets your birthday, you can think the thought, my husband doesn't love me. If he loved me, he'd remember my birthday. How does that leave you feeling? It leaves you feeling lonely, pissed off, and not that good. If you think the thought, somebody who loves me forgot my birthday, now you have some concern, but you're not feeling bad. Your self-esteem didn't go down. You're not feeling resentful. So your thoughts are one of the first things that you have control over, and we can think positive thoughts. That's why all these self-help books and podcasts and blogs and so forth are valuable to listen to. People should be listening to some uplifting messages right now, listening to the people that can keep you calm. Another thing you can do is you can visualize 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months out that your business survived, that you still have a job, you didn't lose your house, you didn't die, your kids are all well, your mom survived, etc. Because all fear comes from imagining something in the future that hasn't happened yet. Even if there was a rattlesnake or a cobra in your room, for you to feel afraid, you'd have to go into the future and imagine that snake coming around you and strangling you or biting you. That hasn't happened yet. It would be much better to be in the rational mind and say, look for exits, look for a stick, whatever. But sometimes we get so afraid, we get into fight or flight, we're not rational anymore. And then what do? Your behavior. I mean, stocking up on 9 months worth of toilet paper so that no one else has one is probably not the smartest thing to do. We know that, at least in America, the supply lines for grocery stores, for pharmacies are still very much intact, and everything's being done to keep them intact. I think that it's your responsibility to control your thoughts, control your images, and control your behavior in ways that will get you to where you want to go. I don't think it's valuable right now to be blaming the government, blaming the Chinese, as some people are doing. They're calling it the Chinese virus or the Kung flu. Those kind of things are not helpful. But I think what is helpful is to keep thinking, what will get me where I want to go? And where I want to go is thrive and survive through this.
Have you always believed it's possible, whatever it might be, or did you learn how to believe it's possible?
I learned. I grew up in a very negative family. My father was an alcoholic. My mother was an alcoholic. They blamed everything on the government, the rich capitalists, whatever it was. And so that's where I grew up. Now, I didn't really learn all this until I met W. Clement Stone. I was probably 24, something like that. It was a matter of hanging out with him and the people he hung out with, reading the books, listening to the audios and the videos, attending seminars and so forth.
To this day, I still think that's when I look at your work and I see that phrase, believe it's possible. To me, I don't know how to, look, I've not had the chance to put together the kind of work that you have done. My books have been more investing type books. But when I look at that phrase, believe it's possible, I see so many people over the last 20 years I'll come in contact with, and that seems to be the one part where they can't believe it's possible. They need some way to pull out, and you can give them a few words, you can direct them to some books, but it always just strikes me that how many people don't believe it's possible.
Well, you know what's interesting? I interviewed 75 people when I wrote the first Success Principles book. I interviewed people that were generals in the Army, people that were top salespeople, people that were Olympic and professional athletes, people that were movie stars, people like Stephen Jobs and people like that. And what happened is every one of them believed it was possible. So I thought, if you want to be successful and be one of those 1%ers or the top 3%, you got to think like they do. It's like, what thoughts are they thinking? What magazines are they reading? What books are they reading? Who are they listening to? Who are the influences in their life? And I want to get myself into that. I was just in India all of February. I went to an Ayurvedic healing center in Mumbai. My wife and I took a month off. Again, one of the reasons I look as young as I do is I do those kind of things, fasting and healing and longevity type things. Anyway, the point was there was a doctor there who was the doctor who invited me to come to this clinic, who was amazing. He was in the same lineage of doctors from the first doctor that was Buddha's physician. So for 2,500 years, they've been passing down these traditions of ancient healing. We often talk about alternative medicine. It's really allopathic Western medicine that's alternative. For 2,000 years, they've been testing all these herbs and acupuncture points and so forth that we know work. One of the things he said was when he went to work with his teacher, he said, I'll teach you, but you have to devote 1,000 days to being my student, meaning for 3 years, you have to do everything I do, drink what I drink, eat what I eat, think what I think, read what I read, meditate when I meditate, etc. And if you'll do that for 3 years, I'll teach you. Today, we all want to learn something by reading one book, listening to 2 podcasts, or watching 10 TED Talks. The reality is it takes time to get that clay off the golden Buddha that we talked about earlier. Someone once said, I love this quote, said, success is a marathon, not a sprint. And so 26 miles as opposed to a 100-yard dash takes a little time, a little commitment. But I think we all can learn to believe that it's possible. And then just recently, I wrote a foreword to 2 books. One was called From Homeless to Billionaire by a guy who arrived in Thailand when he was 22 or 3. Maybe he was 19, I think, actually. And now he's 35 and he's a billionaire 3 times over. He went from homeless, living on the beach in Phuket, to being a billionaire. And then I wrote the foreword to another book called The Billionaire's Secret, written by Raphael Bedziag from Poland, I think. He interviewed 21 billionaires. It took him 5 years to get to 21 billionaires who would actually give him this time. Every one of them, from the time they were a kid, chose to believe it was possible. And a lot of people talked about it was a choice. I just knew that if I was going to be successful, I had to believe it was possible. Because we won't do what's not possible. If I said to you, I'm going to do a seminar tonight, 10 o'clock. It's going to be online. I will teach everyone within 1 hour how to levitate at least 1 foot off the ground for 20 minutes. No one signs up. Why? Because they've never seen anyone do it. They've never heard of anyone that could do it. And so they don't believe it's possible. And I wouldn't blame them. But the fact is, If you didn't believe it was possible, you'll never sign up. I'm not suggesting you should for that. But the point is that you have to believe it's possible, or you won't take the time to invest the time, the money, and the effort to achieve what it is you want to achieve.
This podcast that you're on right now, I think I've done 500 plus interviews in the last 8 years. There's been 6 Nobel Prize winners on here, a lot of people that you probably know personally. I want to ask you, though, as you mentioned the 75 that you spoke with, these really prominent folks, Steve Jobs is an example for the success principles. Who stands out? Because there's got to be a couple that really just stand out. Not that they weren't all great and valuable, but who stands out? And what were some of those just moments where you're like, wow, something just happened there. The electricity just sparked and you were like, oh my, okay, this really grabbed me. Does anything really jump out at you of those 75?
Well, I'll share a story that jumped out at me that it was not my story. It's one from the Billionaire Secret book. But when I was reading that to write the foreword, it blew me away. There was a kid in China who was not good in school. In fact, he just hated it so much he managed to get himself thrown out. He was literally, as a teenager, the only thing he could do was tend the cows in his little local rural community. At one point, he realized, I'm never going to be anything if I don't change my way. And he said, I need to study and I need to learn to read. They wouldn't let him back in school. So he would take his brother's textbook and he would have his brother teach him some words. And finally, he realized he needed to get a dictionary. He went down to the river and with a sickle, he would cut grass in the morning and then sell it to the farmers to feed to their cows like hay. It took him 1.5 years to earn enough yuan in order to buy a dictionary. And then he memorized every word in that dictionary. And then he realized he needed an encyclopedia if he was really going to become educated. It took him 3.5 years to make enough money to buy an encyclopedia. Little by little, he educated himself to where eventually, I believe I have the story right, he is now one of the major manufacturers of all auto windshields in the world. And he's now a billionaire. And I thought about what kind of courage and what kind of belief it takes to know at that young age, if I'm going to be successful, I have to change my ways. I have to believe it's possible. I mean, you and I could go out now. There's a dictionary online. We have a computer. He didn't have that. But the perseverance it takes to spend 3 years just to earn enough money to go buy a dictionary. You and I will walk into Barnes & Noble or go on Amazon and buy a dictionary in a minute. That kind of story inspires me. And every story in that book was someone like that who started repairing computers and then couldn't get parts for computers. So then they had to become a parts importer. Then eventually they became the #1 computer distributor in all of Eastern Europe. Little by little, just doing the next thing, believing that if I do this and do it well, it will lead to the next thing, and then I'll be successful.
I've had the chance to be in mainland China many times. I've had a chance to walk on the Great Wall. It's a great experience, as you noted earlier. I've also had the chance to speak before. I think at one time it was a crowd of 1,500 people. For a guy writing investment books, that was pretty amazing. I've never seen anything like that. And everybody was so energized and so juiced. And I think you make a point earlier also about this time where, okay, the virus that has swept the world happened to have come from China. I do hear a lot of negative messages about China right now, and I think it's unfortunate because every time that I've been in mainland China in the last decade, all I have felt is people that just want to share with me, people that want me to see what's going on there. And I got to tell you, when you go to a place like Shanghai, as you know, oh my gosh, you're like, wow, this is crazy. The amount of human energy and achievement is off the hook. And I really do think that right now, this is a trying time, but I think people are losing sight of the fact that what's going on in China is not exactly what's going on in the media.
No, there's very little that goes on in the media that's really reflective of anything real in the world, from my opinion. I was over in Iran a couple of years ago. It's considered one of the axis of evil. The Americans are not supposed to like Iran. We had a little tiff where we were sending missiles back and forth a couple months ago. Everybody there loved me. I was checking out of my hotel at 4 a.m. and to get the flight to Dubai to come home. And this young 20-year-old at 4 a.m. reaches across. He looks around and he says, "I love your country." And I said, "Really? Tell me more." "I love your music. I love your art. I love your television shows. I love your clothes." The fact is, most people just want to raise their kids. They want to have a job. They want to do well. They want to do what they love to do. They want to grow themselves. They want to not get sick and die. They want their children to be healthy, etc. It's our governments that get in the way. And then the media fans all that because whenever there's fear or panic, just like we're seeing now, that's what makes people watch. Used to say in the media, blood sells. I think the fact that most people are just humane, caring, nice people. There are some crazies out there for sure, but we know who they are. We can feel it when we get close to them. But I agree with you. I think a lot of countries and a lot of people take a bad rap, and I don't think it's good for anybody.
I would hazard a guess that right now, not because of the virus, but perhaps in spite of it, but I would think that there could be no greater opportunity for just about anything than right now. Because you mentioned the story earlier, at the very beginning about, okay, I got a divorce from my wife. It wasn't great. It forced me to rethink things. If people are truly open and let go of their prior scripts that they had planned and are open to what's right now, the possibilities that have opened because of this trying time are endless.
Mm-hmm. Just to give you an example of creativity, I was on a podcast this morning with a guy up in Canada who is an entrepreneur, and he works with entrepreneurs. And he was giving some examples of what people are doing. One guy owns a gym. He has a ton of treadmills and bicycles and spinning bicycles and all that stuff. Of course, you're not allowed to go out in the world. You can't congregate in gymnasiums. They've all been shut down in California, and spas and all this kind of stuff, workout places. He quickly decontaminated everything, went online to all his customers and says, if you'd like to rent a bike or a treadmill or some weights or whatever, I would be glad to deliver them to your home. You'll pay a rental fee. That'll allow me to keep my doors open. I'll be able to pay my rent and so forth. When it's all done, I'll take them back and we can continue on as usual. That kind of creativity is what's being required by people now. When the first big financial crash happened in 2008, a lot of people went online on eBay to sell stuff so they could survive. This one woman realized most people had never used UPS and they'd never shipped anything bigger than maybe a box like you can carry. Now they're selling dressers and they're selling stereo systems and all that. She put an ad in the local paper and then started taking Facebook ads and Google ads. If you sell something, I'll come pick it up and I'll ship it for you and you'll pay me a small fee for that. She made out like a bandit during that period of time by being creative. I think we're being asked to be creative. We're being asked to think outside the box. We're being asked to think, how can I partner up with people to do things? And I think we're being asked to think just in terms of how do we relate to people in general? Can we do something where we're selling from our heart, not from fear? A lot of the selling that goes on is fear-based. There's only 3 left, and if you don't buy by midnight, you're not going to be able to get the discount and all that kind of stuff. I think we need to let that go right now.
As you were giving that story about the guy in Canada, I thought to myself, gosh, I've got to give Jack one that he can pass on to the next person. Vietnam exports a lot of dragon fruit to China. But in the middle of this, the exporting of dragon fruit has basically stopped. A lot of rotting dragon fruit in Vietnam. So the enterprising bakers in Saigon have figured out that if they take the dragon fruit pulp and when they're making their banh mi bread, use dragon fruit pulp, the pink dragon fruit, instead of water, they're now ending up with banh mi loaves that have got a pink hue with a kind of aromatic fruit taste, very light, and it's delicious. And so here you have the mother of all invention. China can't buy dragon fruit right now because of this, and so they use dragon fruit for pulp to make the bread. All of a sudden, I'm sure in the not too distant future, Vietnam will become famous for its pink banh mi.
There you go. There you go. And there'll be a lot of that that will happen. I think another thing too, and I would just say this not to sound self-serving, but this is a time when people are home. I teach something in the morning called the Hour of Power, for example, which is 20 minutes of meditation, 20 minutes of reading, and 20 minutes of exercise. I'm doing some fitness kind of thing. Most people are sequestered and they can't get out of their home. So now you don't have that hour-long or 2-hour-long commute in the morning, or if you add them up at the end of the day and so forth. So why not read those books you've been putting off? Why not engage in some self-reflection? Why not engage in meditation? And whether it's my book or someone else's book is irrelevant, but I think that there's so many things right now that you can do to get fitter, to develop your brain, to get some more information, to clean up some messes. One of the chapters in my workbook is clean up your messes and incompletes. My wife and I, this weekend, normally I would have been out at this fundraiser in Los Angeles helping Bob Proctor and some other people you know raise money for a foundation called Unstoppable that builds schools in Africa, but that was canceled. We've cleaned out our garage. We have gone through all of our Tupperware and made everything fit, and the things that don't have caps are going out to Goodwill. We have gone through our clothes and said, I'm never going to wear that again. So there's a lot of things you can do right now that are things you've been putting off. Spending time with your family, spending time with your kids, developing your website, writing that book you've been thinking about, putting together the outlines for the next 10 podcasts you want to do. The key thing is to look at, again, the opportunities that exist and focus on, well, I often teach this concept called turning a have to into a get to. I used to have to drive on the 405 freeway in LA. And if you know anything about that, it's 12 lanes wide. It looks like a parking lot at 5 o'clock. But I created some games I could play as I was driving home. One game was called Don't Touch the Brake. It was like golf. The low score wins, and I'm always trying to break my score. So if I drive really, really, really slow and leave enough space between me and the car in front of me, I'll never have to hit the brake. But if I drive too slow, a car is going to come in from the right side or the left side into the lane that's now got an open space in it in front of me, and I have to hit the brake. It's a fun game to play. This commute, which used to be a pain in the butt, became a fun time. Now that you have to be sequestered or your business is not allowed to operate or whatever, ask yourself, how can I turn this into a get to? What are the things that I get to do that I normally didn't get to do? I think a lot of that can be very useful and helpful in terms of your income, making money. You could be studying the stock market, reading books by Ray Dalio and Tony Robbins, Unshakable, and all that kind of stuff. Don't think of this as negative. Think of it as unseen for yet positive, and start looking for the good.
I got to tell you, the one thing that I really love about the success principles, beyond the content, the heavy content of the book, but I love reading a table of contents that when you finish reading the table of contents, you're already energized to go run through a wall. I mean, right? Because I admire how much time and energy went into the table of contents. I mean, seriously. The book, The Success Principles Workbook, an action plan for getting from where you are to where you want to be. And good-looking Jack on the front cover to go along with the book, The Success Principles as well. Where can we send people, Jack? What's the best website beyond Amazon to buy all your books? But where's the best website would you like to direct people to?
Well, I think go to the successprinciplesworkbook.com and you can get some free bonuses there if you buy the book and let us know you did it. Or if you buy it through the website, ours, it'll take you to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Books A Million, whatever. You get 10 weeks of a video coaching program by me for free. You get to download the first chapter of the book when you go there and you buy it before the book will ever come to you in the mail. And also, I'm doing some live master classes where I'm teaching 2 hours from the workbook, where I'll take you through some of the exercises, literally some of the core exercises that are normally things I don't teach. I learned some amazing things in India that I'm going to share with people about how to actually activate your subconscious mind in ways that I've been teaching this for like 50 some years. And I learned some new things that I'm going to be sharing in that. That's probably the best way to go. And I would also encourage you, just go to jackcanfield.com and sign up to be on my mailing list, because I've done 3 free seminars on how to survive in a challenging time. And I'll be continuing to do that. Another thing that I'll do over the next couple of months is I'm going to do some free seminars where I take you for an hour. One of the things we know is that all your limiting beliefs, the majority of them started between the ages of 3 and 8 years old. We can go back through a technique I've learned to literally take you back to that time and get you unstuck. So the reason you're stuck and not being able to make a relationship work or get the finances you want or the job you want or whatever it is, we can literally find the limiting belief that's keeping you stuck, that's unconscious, that you don't even know you have. And we can release that belief. I did this for over 12,000 people in the month of January, just as a gift to my mailing list. The results were extraordinary. There's a number of things you can get, and you'll be on the list to receive information about that. Just jackcanfield.com.
As you note, there's no better time with all the time that we have being locked up in the house to go jump right in, right?
Exactly.
Jack, I appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. This was really fun. I had a good time. You're a good guy to just hang out and talk with.
Thank you, sir. Take care, man.
Okay, you too, buddy.
Going back to one of the founding fathers of systems trading, of trend following today, my guest, Bill Dreiss. Bill takes his experience back to the 1970s, maybe even earlier. Not unlike many rogue traders, so to speak, and Bill might not like that word, but I say rogue affectionately. But somebody outside the system doing his own thing, going about it his own way, choosing his life. Frankly, a life of freedom. He did not go the direction of having the most assets under management, but he has endured for decades with an approach that's rock solid scientifically. This is one of those moments where you get a chance to dive into the mind of someone who's essentially a founding father in the industry. I hope you enjoy this conversation with systems trader Bill Dries. I want to jump in with one of your, I don't know if you would call them your heroes, but Benoit Mandelbrot. I want to stay at something very philosophical at the beginning. And he had a point in talking about the 2008 time period. And he's talking about the efficient market theory proponents. He said they like to take these 2008 events and sweep them under the rug like they're an act of God and forget about them. I'm sure you connect with that. Why don't you tell the audience where he's really going with that?
Actually, what he's saying is that from a statistical point of view, the markets are not random walks. There's a bias in the markets, there's a persistence in the markets that leads mathematically to what we call fat tails. This is an intrinsic characteristic of the market. It's not sort of an exception or something that's out of the ordinary. It's an intrinsic behavior of the market. What I did, I was working for Mandelbrot. I applied his idea of fractal dimension to the different markets and actually did an analysis of all the markets to see if they had essentially a fractal dimension that indicated that they were persistent. After going through all the markets and finding that to be true to varying extents, I had what I considered to be a scientific argument for Mandelbrot's conjecture. That's what he's saying. He's saying that the efficient market hype guys got it wrong when they were assuming that the markets were random. Part of the reason for that, in my opinion, was that these were top economists and people like that. They were unable to beat the market themselves, so they decided that nobody else could beat it either, and then came up with the idea that the markets were purely random. What's notable that Mandelbrot's first paper on fractals dealt with the cotton market. His first paper on fractal geometry dealt with the futures market in cotton. He started off in that direction. It was the exception. There was a book called The Random Nature of Stock Market Prices or Stock Prices that was popular back in the 50s or 60s. And he was the dissenting voice in relation to the random walk theory of the markets. Even now, it seems to be embedded in the academic view of the markets. It's long since been proven, not only by analysis, but just by experience, that that's not true. And I think pretty much the idea that the markets do in fact have fat tails, shall we say, is pretty much accepted, certainly among market participants. That's what provides the basis for trend following. It basically says that trends persist longer than would be expected if it were a random distribution. And so that extra extension is what provides the opportunity for trend following to work. It's true for everybody. The particular methodology I use is based upon fractal geometry, but the persistence in the markets is what makes any reasonable trend following system operational.
Let me keep it at the word academic for a moment. If someone looks at your background, they're going to be like, wow, Bill, MIT, Harvard, this is the start of what somebody would call as an academic pedigree. But you go to the more practical side. I mean, of course, we'll speak to it in a little while, but early on, operations research, defense contracting, whatnot. So you saw your side of that, but then you go to the speculative side, go out there and kill it entrepreneurial side. You're a pioneer. You've been doing this for a long time, and we're going to go back to your early career in a second. But what were you thinking while you're trading? You're making money. You're making a lot of money over many decades. All of these academic folks are getting all of this publicity, all of these wrong messages are going around. And I'm not going to say you or other trend followers were in entire anonymity, but it was pretty anonymous for a very long time. What were your internal thoughts when you would watch these academics going down this one path, and here you are actually living it and seeing something entirely different?
You talked about my academic pedigree, but I stepped out of that, shall we say, just in time. I went to work for a think tank in California when I got out of business school. We were doing pretty much state-of-the-art modeling in terms of force structure analysis and missile targeting and that sort of thing. This was at the height of the Cold War. A lot of that involved looking at things from first principles. That is, instead of taking existing tools, we actually re-derived or invented various techniques. That led us into a much more independent way of thinking about these things. What I found over the years is that there are a number of topics in which the scientific consensus is not supported. But this is sort of one of my early discoveries. So the point is, I think to some extent that the academics are overeducated. That is, they learn models, generally physics models, that they then try to apply to markets. And these models are not appropriate. Had they started at a more basic level in analyzing these things, they'd come out in the same place that I've come out and other traders.
The freedom that you had is what gave you the advantage, the freedom to go down the path and explore.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, I've lived my life to sort of maximize that freedom, the way I've arranged my life. I've had the opportunity to think about a lot of things, shall we say, independently of a structure that is in some ways fairly restrictive. The whole idea of publishing, and in other words, most academicians have a day job that keeps them from spending a lot of time doing creative thinking, shall we say. I think I've just had the freedom of not being in that institutionalized environment. And I think that's true. If you talk to other CTAs, I find there's a lot of similarity between that. I know of other CTAs who have been interested in physics and interested in various other topics that had nothing to do with CTAs and had original ideas on these topics that are not in the textbooks and that are not quackery, because these are educated, intelligent people. There's another world out there that exists more or less independent of academia.
Before you even got to the point that you had some of your early trend following systems, what would have been the first example that you read about or understood as someone else doing this trend following thing? Would that have been Donchian?
Yeah, I was introduced to Donchian by my boss at this think tank I was working in. He was a retired Air Force colonel, had come across Donchian. He sort of introduced me to Donchian and got me interested in it. I had access to Air Force computers. We had a little bit of advantage in terms of testing systems and trying them out. I read Edwards and McGee, all the Bible of technical analysis, and I found that somewhat helpful. And in fact, I found that most of the patterns that they used were not informative. Really, the only patterns that counted were things like trend lines and support and resistance. So I set out to design a system that automated that kind of technical trading. That was my first system. Later on, my second system, the one that started in 1991, was based upon a more sophisticated analysis of the data, that is, that came from Mandelbrot, but generally the same features that my original model had in terms of trend lines and support and resistance.
Can I keep you at that early stage, though? I'm curious. I bring up Donchian, you bring up Edwards and McGee, two very different thinkings. What did you do with Donchian when you first saw what he was doing and understood what he was doing? Did you go ahead, code it, reverse engineer it, and figure it all out for yourself?
Well, no, I think Donchian was pretty, as I recall.
Moving average.
Yeah, I think moving average crossovers, if I remember correctly. Yeah, it was pretty basic stuff. In the early days, simple systems worked really well because nobody was using them. You're competing against discretionary traders who had all the impediments of that style of trading. Almost any system would beat what the average discretionary trader would do. And that changed a bit over time as more and more people got into business. But nevertheless, the business is pretty much the same as it was. That is, it's a matter of designing a system and then sticking with it.
Let me keep you also with some of those early stage personal philosophies. In preparing to talk with you today, I don't know if I saw you use the word necessarily, but I'm sure you have at various times. I started to think of isolation. Isolation in the sense that here you are, you're figuring out where you want to go. You've got a few pieces of information, a few data points of other people and other things. You weren't necessarily on a collaborative team. This was kind of like you and your thoughts. You weren't calling up Bill Dunn and John Henry and Ed Secoda. You were doing your own thing.
Yeah, that's right. I think they were doing their own thing too. We were all discovering the same phenomena, basically. Those people you mentioned, I know Ed Secoda and Marty Bergen, they basically made the same discovery, if that's the word, or I should say they confirmed the discovery of Donchian that a system would generally be discretionary traders or most traders in terms of the market. This has all been talked about extensively recently with Daniel Kahneman in his Thinking Fast and Slow. And he talks about how systems, comparing clinicians against simple systems, the systems tend to do better, not because they're smarter, but just because they're more reliable. They aren't subject to a lot of biases, a lot of psychological biases and other kinds of biases that tend to work against the trading. In other words, we're really born with certain psychological biases, and they're very, very hard to overcome. And of course, as a systems trader, the hardest thing to do is to stick with your system, because you're always looking at the markets and you're saying, oh, gee, maybe it's going somewhere else or whatever. The most important part that is understood by all of these traders that you mentioned and anybody who is successful at trend following is you basically got to stick with your system, regardless of what you think the markets are going to do.
But when you first saw Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, here you are, a trend following trader doing this for decades, back to the 70s, even the 60s. But when you see Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow for the first time, isn't there a side of you, not to take anything away from Daniel Kahneman, isn't there a side of you that says, well, gosh, me and some of my peers figured a little bit of this out a long time ago, before it was popular?
That's exactly right. Yeah, you read this in the sense, but by the same token, Daniel Kahneman was doing his work at about the same time that we were doing our work. And we were operating in different spheres, and maybe we didn't know about him, didn't know about us, but by the same token, it wasn't like we scooped Daniel Kahneman. It's just we were applying it, and we were applying his first application of an algorithm to clinical practice was back in the 70s. So it was just a matter of different people working on different fields that were discovering this.
Let me take you back to where I started this conversation with, because I would love for you to put your professorial hat on to the extent that you want. Let's imagine you've got a room full of doctors, attorneys, young MBAs, all kinds of people, and they don't know about you. They say, gosh, he did really well in 2008. Now, I saw that movie, The Big Short, and the one guy did really well in the movie, The Big Short, but this guy, Bill, he did something different. He was in all kinds of markets that were moving. Give a blow-by-blow as to why a year, and there could be many years and many events we could go through, but 2008 seems like a good one, why that year could unfold to where you could do so well. A lot of people will think, if they hear your track record for that particular year, they'll think, oh, he did what the Big Short guy did, or he just shorted the S&P. They won't have this holistic thinking that it was all of these markets moving.
There was no decision involved in that process. That was the business I was in. I didn't change my trading at all. I might say that this was a banner year for all CTAs, or for, I should say, all trend followers. And the simple reason was the markets trended very strongly. Anybody who was a trend follower was going to capitalize on that. The difference between me and the guys in The Big Short is they actually dug into this stuff and figured out what was going on and had a specific plan to deal with it. Me, I was just lucky. It was just a market situation, which was very amenable to the way that I trade. but I didn't do anything different or didn't foresee anything. I didn't foresee the crash, anything. It just happened, and I was in the right place at the right time.
Well, your strategy from the ground up was built to take what the markets give you. You weren't trying to tell the markets to give you what you want at any particular time. You're saying, I'll take what you give me.
That's right. And that's, again, where persistence come in. The markets exhibit persistence, and that persistence is what allows me and other trend followers to make money.
I know, going back in time, a surfer, a fan of surfing. How long have you surfed?
I started surfing when I got out of college, actually. Just sort of got the bug. And I mean, one of the reasons I got into commodities was that it was something I could do from wherever I wanted, could live wherever I wanted to, and design my life around surfing and living in those places that had good surf. And of course, that was until the last few years. I've, shall we say, tapered off a bit just because of age. But for a long time, surfing really defined my life, defined where I lived and what I spent my time doing.
We're going to talk about a lot of things that are inspirational today, but that's a really inspirational point for people to think of in this day and age where so many people don't design their life. Maybe they talk about it, and there's a lot of books about designing your life today, but it's really a cool story that you decided early on, man, I love surfing. Wow, this commodity trading, and okay, I can get a system, and then I can choose how I live. Putting that all together, people talk about this on social media and share all these ideas now, and Tim Ferriss has a book about what you just described, but you were doing it a long time before. Did you have anybody in your life that was giving you these freedom ideas to go live that way? Or did you just look at it and say, okay, this trading thing looks really cool. I really want to surf. Wow, let's connect the dots here, and this is what I'm going to do.
It sort of evolved. It wasn't necessarily something that came to me all at once, but what I remember is that I was working for a company and doing that. And I looked and I saw, and I thought about, what about my boss? Do I want his job? Do I want to work 60 hours a week, 80 hours a week or whatever, and make more money and buy a car, a big house? And then what about his boss? Do I want to be his boss? And then I said, no, I want to have leisure time. I want to retire when I'm young so that I can do those things, so that I'm physically and mentally able to do the things I want to do. I'll worry about my old age when I get there.
Is there anything in the surfing mentality that you've connected to your trading or that you see philosophically, the act of surfing?
There's a whole sociology behind surfing, and especially when I got into it, it was sort of an outlaw mentality, and the idea of being free and being able to travel and being able to follow the surf. The surf is a very, shall we say, jealous companion, because when it comes up, you got to be there. In other words, it's not like skiing or something where there's snow in the mountains and you go to the mountain and ski. It's like the surf comes up at what used to be unpredictable times, and you had to be available to go surfing when the surf was up. That was just a general characteristic of the sport. From the world I live in, the surfing world, the way I lived is a way that a lot of people live. They weren't necessarily commodity traders. They were cab drivers or doctors, anybody who could manage their own lives to the point where they could do what they wanted more or less when they wanted to. And so after a while, that's just the world I lived in for most of my life. And of course, the other advantage of that is I've been able to think about a lot of different things in depth, not commodities or surfing. I've been able to give free rein to my imagination or my research in other fields. And there was also the broader movement of the counterculture and all this that had to do with dropping out or whatever. But I wasn't really dropping out. I was just adopting that attitude towards living that focused more on the moment than on planning for the future or accumulating wealth or whatever.
One just curiosity surfing question. Was there ever, maybe all, maybe none, did any of your surfing companions ever come up to speed or get an inkling of the career that you were living?
Oh, yeah. Nobody really knows what it's like to be a trader except for a trader. On the other hand, they knew what I did, that I made my money by trading the markets and that it didn't take me a lot of time, and I ran a computer program and so on and so forth. And some of them are well-educated and sophisticated enough to have a general idea of what I did. But people I surf with had different professions, but the idea was that they had all worked out their own lives such that they could be free to be surfing, at least a lot of the time, to be available when the surf came on. From my view, I'm not a particularly unique person. I had a particular way of making myself available to the surf, and other people had their own ways. And it was sort of the beginning. And in those days, there weren't a lot of people that did that. You pretty much went through all the steps to your career and all that. And I just stepped off the bus, I guess.
Did you always have the even keel that I see right now, even when you were, let's say, 21, or were you always pragmatic and thoughtful about how you looked at things, very even keeled?
I wouldn't call myself even keeled. I was pretty crazy.
Okay, give me a couple crazies before I get into more trend following.
Well, I don't know if I want to go there. But...
Okay, let's go back to trend following. Back in the day, here's what Donchian's doing. You look at Edwards and McGee, and you probably got it, I don't know, you'll tell me, but maybe some inclination about where some other people were going at that point in time. And I guess you could have gone the Donchian direction, and you could have, as you described, a fairly simple approach. Your approach, I checked out your interview with Niels at Top Traders, and Niels is a good guy. But your approach is a touch more complicated than a typical trend following price action system. It seems like you're getting to the same place, but you're getting there in your own unique way.
Yeah, I guess I was taken by the geometrical aspect of traditional technical analysis. My original idea was to take what was valuable in that technical analysis and turn it into a system so that it was not based on judgment. In other words, if you're drawing trend lines and things like that, if you're doing that from a discretionary basis, there's a lot of different possibilities there. And of course, that changes. Then you're in a position of using your judgment to determine where you would put the trend lines. And of course, that leads to the kind of inconsistency that I'm trying to avoid. All I did was take what seemed to be fairly straightforward rules and turn it into essentially a system, a computer program.
Do you think that Edwards and McGee, I'm assuming the answer would be no, they put that work together without the systematic computer approach that you did?
I put my original system together largely without computers because I was one of the first people to have a PC back in 1976, early 1976. Most of my system development and system testing and all that was done manually with CRB chart books and that sort of thing. But I had a computer mentality, shall we say. You don't have to have a computer to run a system. You have to think like a computer. In other words, do the same thing over and over. Computerizing the strategy was just a matter of taking that logic, those procedures, and programming them into code.
Why don't you go ahead, because as I mentioned a second ago, your approach, the fractal wave algorithm, as you describe it, is quite a different approach than if somebody was to explain a breakout price action trading system. It's getting to a similar ending. It's taking what the market gives you. It's trying to get the meat of the trend. How would you describe the fractal wave algorithm to the novice or the experienced? Because I don't think most people are familiar with it.
Well, once again, it's based upon the premises of fractal geometry, where you have nested patterns. You have a pattern within a pattern within a pattern. The most basic pattern is just a zigzag pattern. Price goes up, down, and then up. And so you can use that as the kernel or as the basis for developing a system that incorporates higher and higher levels of detail, or I should say, when it comes down to it, the performance of the system is really based upon the underlying theory of these distributions that have fat tails. Although it was attractive to design this around the fractal wave algorithm, that's obviously not a necessary.
Worked for you. You figured it out.
Yeah, it worked for me. What we were doing at the time, we were looking at, when I say we, I was working with a friend of mine, Art von Wahlberg. He's the one who actually came up with the logic behind the fractal wave algorithm. But what we were trying to do was to automate the Elliott wave, which was popular at the time. And we found out that that was impossible because the Elliott wave is overdetermined and because it relies too much on discretion, determining where the waves are and so on and so forth. And what came out of that was a simpler algorithm, which is the fractal wave algorithm, which it's probably more like the Dow theory, which you have a series of higher highs and higher lows and a series of lower highs, and then those make a larger pattern of higher highs and higher lows, which make a larger pattern of higher highs and lower lows. So the fractal wave algorithm was essentially the automation of the Dow theory. That provided a substrate then for determining where you would put your entry orders and your stop loss orders and so on and so forth. The fractal wave algorithm provided a structure, but it wasn't in itself a system. It was just a structure that gave you various options as to where to actually place your trades.
Your time frame, weekly bars?
Yeah. My first system was daily. After a few years, I don't know if it was the markets or what, but it became less effective. When I got into exploring the fractal wave algorithm and all that, my first idea was to trade short-term system in the direction of a long-term system, the direction of a long-term indicator. What I discovered was that I might as well just trade the long-term indicator. In other words, instead of taking pieces out of a trend, I'd try to get as much of the trend as possible. Now, obviously, that exposes you to a bit more risk, but the risk is mitigated by just trading a number of markets. So I trade about 40 different markets. It was easier to manage. It was something that lazy, and it was easier to trade off the weekly charts. And second, it seemed to be more in tune with the actual market fundamentals, because after all, whatever we do in commodities is really based upon the cash markets. I think of myself as being a fundamental trader who trades the fundamentals technically. In other words, I believe in the fundamentals, but I don't trade directly based on those. I trade on the idea that when the price of copper goes up, people start digging new mines and so forth, and then you get oversupply and then so on and so forth. So you have these cycles that have to do with particular commodities. They're sort of business cycle timeframes, 4 years or something like that. If you're trading out to a certain extent, if you're trading longer term, you're more in tune with those longer term cycles. That's essentially where I ended up. It was partly a matter of convenience, but just partly a matter of it seemed to match the market better and avoid a lot of the noise.
There's no doubt that what you've just said should resonate with people that I'm about to describe, but I see so much communication, so many people that will say, I'll ask them about their strategy and their time frame, because often they'll say, oh, I'm a trend following trader. And I've learned to say, they might be defining it differently than maybe I am. And I'll say, well, what's your time frame? Do you know what the favorite time frame that I hear in the last couple of years is? They'll tell me they're a trend following trader. They tell me their time frame is 5 minutes.
They're living in a different universe. I have a good friend who's a high frequency trader. It has nothing to do with what I do. They're in a different business. I know what they do or know enough about what they do to realize that the dynamics, the theory, the behavior of the markets, all of that is much different than in the long term.
I would think that if people, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree, that if people want to be inspired by you and look to the high frequency traders. I met a gentleman over in Singapore a couple of years ago who showed me his shop, his high frequency shop. It sure seems like if people want to take a stab at trading and go down a path, that trying to emulate your path makes a lot more sense than to try to emulate the high frequency path.
Yeah, but if you look at the people that have been around for a long time, they've all gravitated towards the longer term trading, or I should say most of them have. Part of it is that high frequency trading is really a hard game. There aren't that many people who actually are successful at it. When that started out, according to my friend who's been in it since the beginning, when it started out, it was pretty easy because nobody else was doing it. It was the same as when I started out as a systems trader. You really had an advantage over the average trader because you just had the technology that wasn't being widely applied. Apparently, the high frequency trading business is a really tough business these days. And most of the people I think who are doing it are like market makers than they are traders. My opinion is if I were thinking about getting into the business these days, high frequency trading would be the last place I'd look.
There must be something that when people first come into this world, there must be some, I don't know if it's information flow or social media or a gut feel why people think that this short-term stuff would somehow or another be the direction to go in. I'm like you. I think 5 minutes and I'm like, what am I doing? I'm going to be like glued to the screen. I'm going to be stressed. It's nothing I'd want to do.
That's a good point. For instance, one of the things that were popular when I was in my formative years was Beat the Dealer.
Ed Thorpe's book.
Yeah. I thought about that because that was obviously a trading system and so forth. And I thought, what do I want to do? Do I want to sit in a smoky casino all day and all night doing this stuff? No. Really, what I just naturally gravitated towards were methodologies that required the least amount of work for the most amount of gain. And the thing is, if you're trading short term, of course, this is different now, but when I was thinking about these things, the commission rates were just unbelievable, were sky high, $100 a round turn type of thing. The slippage costs, the costs you were paying for slippage were really high. So there were a lot of structural things in the markets that mitigated towards you trading the longer term. It was just too costly to trade short term. Nowadays, it's paying for order flow and all that, so it's a bit different. But nevertheless, you're still really having to deal with the noise. And it's just difficult to do. It requires a lot of attention, lots of computer power, and you got to be next to the exchange and all that sort of thing. It's another world. It's literally another world from the world I live in.
Let me keep you at some of this personal psychology makeup for a moment. I've seen you talk about this, the avoiding of groupthink, that you have not really been. You've already talked about the surfing and very different lifestyle, but you have not been the guy that wanted to be in New York City or Chicago with all of the, quote, players going down that particular direction. Obviously, you figured out a way to do it your way, and it's worked really well. Why did you instinctively know that you wanted to avoid the groupthink, that you didn't want to hear from whatever broker all the time or whatever other trader, and you knew you didn't want to be immersed in that?
It was well known then that 95% or some related percentage of traders lost money. The idea that if you're doing what the 95% is doing, you're obviously not going to be successful. So one of the things, it was important to try to insulate yourself from that so that you weren't sucked into that logic. When you read the news in the paper, the commodity news or whatever, it's always out of date, shall we say, and or frequency. And to put it another way, it's just not informative at all. To avoid that influence, makes sense just to stay away from it. Plus, it was the same sort of thing. I didn't want to be a floor trader where I'm coming in every day and yelling and screaming at everybody. I wanted to live a more relaxed lifestyle.
Were you the first CTA, one of the first CTAs?
I was one of the first. There was a group that centered around Commodity Corp in the East Coast that was sort of independent, really followed Don Sheehan's lead, I think. But we had a group in San Francisco that was more loosely, we didn't really communicate that much, but there were a handful of us who were getting into the business. So I was in the business before it was regulated by the CFTC, before there was a CFTC. I can't say I was the first, I was in the first group, but most of the people, at least the people that I was aware of, really came across this independently. Say, oh, I heard from this guy that's doing this and so on and so forth. I was in the founding group who I think by and large, at least on the West Coast, just made independent discoveries following probably somewhat similar. There were a lot of people who were in the aerospace industry who had mathematical backgrounds and so on and so forth that appealed to them. It's hard to say. That it was in the air. Hard to say who was first.
But you're right there. I guess I should have asked this at the beginning, but when you first, and I'm going to go back in time before this in a second, but when you first really wrapped your arms around the idea of trend following, you had your first system, you knew that, wow, okay, I've got a chance to do what I want for my whole life, lifestyle-wise. What was that feeling? I mean, it must have been a nice feeling to go, because look, if you make enough money doing this pretty quick, you can do the math better than anybody. You could immediately spreadsheet your life out and go, I got enough money to do what I want to do for the rest of my life.
And in fact, that wasn't really an important thing to me. The most important thing for me was to be able to support myself without working too hard, and to provide the time for me to live the life that I wanted to live, which was a surfing life and a life of intellectual freedom. And so I really wasn't focused on the money yet, because I don't know, I just didn't care about it that much. It's probably still the case. I was more interested in maximizing my leisure than I was maximizing my income.
I love your story. Let me take you back even to further a foundational thought, and I'll set it up this way. I had someone on this show a while back. I think she's at Berkeley, actually, a psychologist. Her name's Alison Gopnik. She's written about something called Bayesian babies. The idea that babies, when they learn, they see one thing and they follow it and they follow it. And if it keeps going good and it keeps feeling good, they just keep going that direction. I know your early background, a kind of a Bayesian decision theory thinking. Why don't you contrast that? Because I did not learn this formally in school, but when one starts to understand this Bayesian thinking, it makes so much perfect sense.
The Bayesian decision theory that I took was a technical and sophisticated methodology that really has not found wide application, at least not in business. But you're right, it's more of a way of just looking at the world, or looking at probability theory. So I think that's been a thread that's been with me throughout my life, as I was convinced early on that probability was epistemological, not ontological. And that's influenced my view of probability. But once again, it's not really related to trading or what I'm thinking about in terms of trading. It's a parallel interest that I've had, I suppose.
In your trading, were you always of the mindset that the system that you had, the approach you had, the fractal wave algorithm, always from the beginning that this would be applied uniformly across markets?
Yeah, my original system was not fractal wave, but by the same token, it involved the trend lines and the support and resistance, the basic Edwards and McGee patterns. I think the idea of it being universal came from the fractal wave algorithm, because that was something that it was a way of decomposing data, and that applied to any data stream. I've applied it to other markets in India and Japan and things like that. Not that I've traded those markets, but I've just tested it. And yeah, it pretty much works on everything. Obviously, it works better on some things than others, just because the markets have different histories. But if you were to give me a market and say, would you trade this without testing or anything? I'd say, yeah, apply the same system and off we go. I'd have confidence that it would work the way it has for other markets.
When you're having a good year, no steep drawdown, and you're making a lot of money like 2008, versus another year where you're losing a lot of money, perhaps. Speak to the emotions you're feeling given those different states of the success of your system or the lack of success. I used the phrase earlier, even keeled. Didn't like that one necessarily, but do you feel the same during these periods, or is there something different internally?
It's hard to totally insulate yourself from it. In some extent, I feel more comfortable in down markets than I do in up markets when I'm making money.
Just to clarify, you feel better when you're losing money than making money?
Yeah, I have an idea of where that's going to go and how that's going to end. Whereas when I'm making money, the sky's the limit. If you're going to make a little bit of money or a lot of money or whatever, it's much more variable. I should say maybe the uncertainty is greater when you're making money than it is when you're losing money. So in the sense that you're emotionally reacting to uncertainty, then it's sometimes a bit more comfortable. Just when you're losing money, it's because you're being whipsawed, you're being ground by trades that are getting in and out, in and out. And it's not very exciting. And the thing that it tries your patience, because most of the time the markets are in drawdown. Only a relatively small fraction of the time are they making these runs where you're making a lot of money.
If I'm thinking about your other peers, and you've come at this from what I've seen, and I've talked to a lot of your peers, many of the ones that have been around since you started. But you come at this so different. Even though you've come at this in a very different way, when you look at the correlation of performance, other CTAs compared to you over time, have you been pretty tightly correlated?
Yeah, I have to say that my performance could be used as an index of CTA performance. And of course, it's trend following performance. We don't make money because we're smart. We make money because the markets give us those opportunities. Anyone who has the discipline to follow a system, and of course, not all systems are going to work. There's something that I have never quite figured out what makes a system better or worse than another system. But I think certainly the people who have been around for a long time have honed in on the same time frame and the same basic strategies. So it's a Darwinian process. Weeded out the people. For instance, most money that's in managed futures is in trend following systems. And that's just because the other methodologies haven't survived in competition. So you have to wonder if most of the money's with people who, shall we say, are following trend following systems and all that, who are they taking the money from? And once again, that comes down to fundamentals. That is, there are people, we're basically selling insurance to people who are producers or consumers and need the product and are willing to lock in profits or whatever. And so it's come down to pretty much of a classical arbitrage game or classical. We're willing to take on risk and take on that risk and take it off the shoulders of the people who don't want to carry it. It's all pretty simple after all these years. It's gone through a long evolutionary process, and I think it's pretty much stabilized out.
When I first started digging through, so to speak, and investigating everything I could find on trend following, sometime in the 1990s, but of course that quickly led me going back to your early career and that whole time frame and finding everything I could there too. One of the most interesting things I used to see, though, when I first started getting into this, I couldn't really wrap my arms around it, is it sure seemed like to me that the best traders in the trend following space were 100% systematic. But when I used to go through all those disclosure documents that I would pull from the CFTC, you'd read through the style, and there was always this, we're 95% systematic, but 5% discretion. And I could never figure this out. All these trend following traders were saying they were 5% or 10% discretion. And I was thinking, even before I really wrapped my arms around everything, is like, I don't believe this. This is marketing to appeal to somebody. Because if you're a systematic trend following trader, you're going to believe in the system. But then all of these traders are saying they've got 5% discretion. And here you are, you're very blunt about it. And I'm curious if you've always been 100% systematic.
The people I know, and I know some of the same people you mentioned, they're 100% systematic. That might be a marketing ploy or whatever, but the number one realization is the need to be systematic and to stick with your system and to do what it tells you to do.
If I stay at this idea of a system for a little bit longer, did you play with discretion ever early on, or was it always that your early training, your early research, your early investigation, it was like, nope, it's 100%, this is it? There was never a side of you where it was like, you know, I'm a pretty smart guy. I've done a lot of interesting schooling. There's got to be some of that can add some extra value to my system.
No, I don't know that I ever was interested in. I saw very clearly the idea that 95% of traders lose money and so on and so forth. That was pretty obvious to me that discretionary traders lost money. I had no confidence in my own abilities. I may have tested them out a little bit, but hardly to any extent. I had very low confidence that I had the psychological makeup or just the information to succeed as a discretionary trader.
The Warren Buffett path did not intrigue you.
Yeah, but Warren Buffett does what I do, really. I mean, he's very consistent. He sticks with his trades for years, all that. When you actually dissect what Warren Buffett does, he's a long-term trend follower. The discretionary trader, one thing that characterizes a so-called discretionary trader is that he's got to have the action. He's got to be in the markets. It's a psychological need that he's satisfying. It's not irrational. A system trader is one way of being a long-term trader. And a long-term trader, and this is true in the markets, obviously the best way to trade the markets is put your money in an index fund and let it ride.
Is there something very early in your life, as a teenager perhaps, is there something very early in your life that you can recall that helped you lay the foundation for all the choices that you made?
No, not that I can think of.
The thing is, you have to realize the way that you approach talking about this, you're just very matter of a fact. And I love it. We've talked about some of the earlier stages, but beyond going to school, getting those early jobs and being exposed to the computers at the Air Force stuff and whatnot, was there anybody along the way, or was it just kind of you and your self-taught? Was there anybody along the way that was really influential in the development of your trading?
People that were influential, the people I worked with at this think tank, they had a very unique way of approaching modeling. We were at the cutting edge of modeling.
Put the year on that, Bill, just for context, what year we would have been talking roughly.
This would be the late 60s, shall we say, the late 60s and early 70s. And this was the height of the Cold War, and there was a lot of money going into these new modeling technologies that had been developed by von Neumann and people like that. This was the first stage of applying these technologies. We were doing a lot of really original work. A lot of it was top secret and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, there were a series of models that developed. There's sort of not an infinite number of models out there. There's a limited number of approaches to modeling various phenomena. Most of those models came into being in that era. I read a book not too long ago, The Physics of Wall Street. And the idea was to talk about the various physics models and mathematical models that were being applied. I read through this book. Every one of these models were models that we knew about back in the 60s. And many of them had been resurrected. Things like deep learning, right? Well, this is like neural nets. It's just a continuation of a model that's been around for decades. And this is true with other models. So what's happened at this point is that these models have become careers. And so people specialize in the various types of modeling. But we were much more ecumenical than that. We applied the model, we selected the model to fit the task, not selected the task to fit the model. We call that model shopping. And that's what people do nowadays. They're educated to apply certain kinds of models, and then they take that model and they say, okay, I'm going to apply this to whatever, to commodity trading or whatever, as opposed to saying, what's the appropriate model for this problem? There's a lot of things that I see in terms of modeling and all that haven't changed in years. We're going into probably the second AI winter now. AI hype back in the 80s, when everybody thought machines are taking over and so on and so forth. And now we're hyping AI again. No different than it was. I mean, it's different because you've got the computing power has blown up so much, but data is not thought. Data mining is not thought. And it's thinking, and it's the concept. It's the kind of creativity. Human beings have a creativity that computers are incapable of. And that's going to be true for the foreseeable future. I tend to look at a lot of this high-tech modeling and all that. I mean, if you want to see what AI does, it's like go online and you get all these ads popping up for something you've already bought. I mean, is that intelligence?
One of my favorite guests on this show, maybe you know of him or met him, I don't know, but a gentleman named Robert Aumann, and he won the Nobel Prize in game theory. I was a little petrified to talk to this 90-year-old Israeli game theorist. What was so great about him was the way he explained things and just explaining mutually assured destruction. He's like, look, we had to have the bombers up there ready to go for 40 years straight. That's what kept the peace. One of those light bulb moments where you're just like, wow, he took all the math that he has in his head that the average person can't understand, you probably can, and he just simplified it in a way where you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
Well, that's right. And we were doing very sophisticated modeling, but by the same token, we understood that in an actual nuclear exchange or whatever, most of that stuff wouldn't work. I mean, it would just be chaos. You had to sort of keep up with that game because the other side was keeping up with the game. And then you got to the point you didn't know who was on first. That was essentially my understanding also, is that you were in a situation where you had to do it in what looked like something that was counterproductive, say to the public, was actually necessary in terms of the situation at the time.
One of the favorite topics, in your industry, in the trend following industry, one of the favorite topics of the media about every 5 years, trend following is dead. It's gone. It's over. They're all losing money. It's never going to work again. And then something happens. And this is a pretty repeatable pattern. You've been at this for decades. So much wisdom, so much confidence. I'm not saying cockiness at all, but just a confidence that you see what the landscape looks like. If you have to look ahead of course, markets could change and all this and that. We've got Bitcoin coming online now and all this stuff. But people are people. Given all your decades of wisdom so far, how do you see a strategy of trend following unfolding for the next 50 years?
It'll change in terms of the particulars, I suppose.
You mean what markets are traded, perhaps?
I don't know. Yeah, obviously there's going to be new markets come into play and old markets are going to become inactive and that sort of thing. I think the basic trend following strategy relies on some pretty fundamental characteristics of human psychology and of economics. As long as there are markets, there will be trend following strategies. And I think the same underlying mechanisms that cause those to be viable will persist. My current system, I've been trading for over 30 years now. It's been virtually unchanged in that time. I've tweaked it a little bit here and there, but it's the point. It just keeps working. And the reason it works is not because the system itself, it's because of the environment that exists in the economic sphere. Just can look at what's happening right now. Look at oil markets going up, a lot of volatility in various markets. Let me put it this way. When I look at the markets, the market behavior, I don't see anything that I didn't see 50 years ago. In fact, I've seen markets like sugar and cocoa and things like that just go bananas. I've seen cotton go up the limit 2 weeks in a row and then go down the limit 2 weeks in a row. Things that would be astonishing in today's markets were not so astonishing, as I say, back in the 70s. But by and large, the markets have behaved pretty much the same as they always have.
If you had to look ahead and you say, well, gosh, there's going to be trend following strategies, but there might be changes on the margins, would you also see something like the 40% winners, 60% losers, that type of philosophical foundation will still be a part of trend following too, because we don't have the ability to predict what's going to be the next big trend?
I think there's some general parameters like that a lot of people have discovered and that will continue to persist. That's just sort of the sweet spot in the markets, as it were. It's almost as if the markets are going to extract maximum pain traders. Any strategy that capitalizes on that pain is going to continue to make money. In other words, it's back to psychology that most people are wired to do the wrong thing when they're trading the markets. That's not going to change.
Are you ever going to retire?
I've retired. I've pretty much retired now.
But you're still trading?
Yeah, just for my own proprietary trading. But no, I'm not holding myself out. I've withdrawn my membership from the NFA and CFTC. So I'm not trading for clients. I'm just trading my own money.
But will you ever stop that?
Probably. I'm getting close to that. Because even what I'm doing requires that I stay engaged on a daily basis.
There must be a part of you that loves it, though, still.
Less and less, shall we say. I've got enough money. Just as soon put it in, like I say, in an index fund and forget about it.
Well, listen, I've taken you all kinds of territory. We've got more than enough to do a chapter here, and I can always fill in the blanks a little bit here and there with some great articles about you. So I appreciate you giving me some flavor. And I knew consciously I did not want to take you on a linear path. I wanted to just kind of touch on all kinds of stuff.
Well, I appreciate that. I was sort of apprehensive about having to go through and tell my story once again and so on and so forth.
I did good of not forcing you the same story.
I enjoyed this much more than I thought I would.
Oh, man, I'll take that. Well, listen, again, I've kept you. Thank you for coming on.
And thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced,
college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash, or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.